Great, thank you so much, Sasha, for getting all of, and Hillary, for getting all of this put together for us. It's always a challenge, but it's very much appreciated. We're delighted to have with us Professor Sarah Cameron of the University of Maryland joining us today. Thank you all for coming. Those of you in person, particularly the faces I am seeing who I saw this morning in my lecture. It's very much appreciated that you're taking the time out of your undergraduate days to come to this event. And as promised, it is going to deliver some wonderful material to help you think about our class. So Professor Cameron is the author of an award-winning book, The Hungry Steppe, that is, I promised her I wouldn't get too much into detail, but I do just want to say it's a model of historical writing, both in its clarity and in the dignity that it brings to a remarkable story that she tells, in large part for the first time in English language, of the Kazakh famine, and as a story of Soviet modernization and Soviet nation making in Kazakhstan. I think one of the things that became clear to me that I learned last month at our ACES convention is, I think, a true testament to the significance of the work is it has been translated into Kazakh and is now a resource for people in that country to come to terms with the past and with these events. So it's been a work of great importance. We are so delighted to hear from her today about her new project on the Aral Sea. And I think that with that, I will turn the floor over to Professor Cameron. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Anne, for that very kind introduction. I'd like to thank Anne additionally for facilitating this session, and also to Alexandra Shpetalnik for her help with setting up all the organizational details related to my visit. It's really a pleasure to be here and to be here in person. Wow. So I'll be speaking here about my new project on the book project on the disappearance of Central Asia's Aral Sea. I should say at the outset that I'm still at the beginning of this project. I've completed some research in Kazakhstan, but I'm not yet to conduct research in other countries that will feature in the book, particularly Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. And that means that I'm probably not going to be able to answer every question about the specifics of the Aral Sea case in great depth. But because I'm at an early stage, I especially welcome questions that might help me shape the project as I move forward. So I'm eagerly awaiting your comments. I should also say I particularly welcome questions from undergrads. So if you're in the audience, you're undergraduate, please, I'd love to hear from you. So with all those caveats, I will begin. In the late Soviet period, dust storms of striking force and violence began to be noticed around the Aral Sea, a large body of water located in Central Asia. These storms carried materials from the dried up seabed and scattered them across a vast area. Traces of the seafloor were found as far away as the Fergana Valley, which is one of Central Asia's major agricultural areas, and in Russia north of the Arctic Circle. But the prevailing winds tended to carry many of these materials to the southwest, to places like the Karakalpak ASSR, which is up in part of Uzbekistan, or to Tashawuz Oblast, which is the sort of northern part of Turkmenistan, you can see there. There, the salty mix burns crops and spoils harvests. These dust storms were deeply unsettling to the people who experienced them. Observers described a feeling of confusion and fear. Rahimjan Otarbayev, a Kazakh journalist, editor, and playwright who visited the sea in the 1980s, wrote, quote, "As soon as we approached the sea, we encountered a heavy storm. A white tower rising from the wind blowing to the west lit up the sky and turned everything as far as the eye could see into a ghost in the broad daylight," end quote. Others were struck by the struggle to breathe or move about, half blinded in such an unfamiliar environment. Drivers became disoriented and lost because they could not see the road. Railway trains ground to a halt. Alexander Tarakov, a Russian journalist, noted, quote, "Even an ordinary stroll comes with a price. Salt lashes at your face and remains in your nostrils and ears. When you return home, loved ones are horrified at how your face has been irritated and scarred by salt. Dust also even comes to haunt the literature of the late Soviet era. In Letter to the Afterlife Grandfather, a novel by the Karakalpak writer Tulathurgan Kaiperganov about the Aral Sea, the central character recalls, quote, "I found myself alone among the tornado and sand. My eyes saw nothing. In an instant, a thick whitish dust covered my closed face and lips. It penetrated into my lungs and it gnashed at my teeth," end quote. He took out a handkerchief which he characterized as snow white like milk, which immediately became, quote, a dirty brown rag. The storms that these Soviet observers noted in the 1970s, 1980s, they've actually continued to the present day. And in fact, they've come to occur more frequently. So here in this slide, you can see coverage of a major dust storm from 2018. It got significant news coverage because it actually spread as far south as Ashgabat, which is the capital of Turkmenistan. You couldn't even see it on the map there, but way down further south, just blackened the skies. It led to the closure of airports throughout the region for several days. Planes couldn't take off as the dust was so thick, visibility was impaired. Here you get another shot of just what it was like to actually be in the midst of one of these dust storms. And this again is from 2018. As I'll discuss today, these dust storms are simply one facet of the Aral Sea disaster. Beginning in the 1960s, when the region was under Soviet rule, the Aral Sea, which had been the world's fourth largest body of water, began to dry up. The major driver of the Aral Sea's collapse was the Soviet regime's increasing push for cotton production. And due to its far-reaching environmental and social effects, this disaster has been called one of the 20th century's worst environmental catastrophes. The Aral Sea disaster, its causes and consequences, are the subject of the book that I'm working on right now. That's the one I take the title of this talk from, The Aral Sea, Environment, Society, and State Power in Central Asia. And it's what I'd like to talk to you about today. So this slide gives you a brief overview of the themes and the subjects that I'll address. So I want to talk a little bit in the beginning with an overview of the project, some of the major questions that drive this study, the framing of it. I'll also talk a little bit about, this is clearly a major event of the Soviet era, the post-Soviet era. Why haven't we heard more about it, particularly by historians? So I'll discuss some of that as well. Then I want to focus in more narrowly on some research that I've completed. It comes out of what I believe maybe will be chapter 5 of the book. In that piece, I look at, how did officials and bureaucrats react? How did they conceive of these changes as they were happening, environmental and social changes, and how did they react? And I call those collectively, those environmental and social ailments connected with the Aral Sea's retreat, the Aral syndrome, and I'll talk a little bit more later in the talk about what I mean by that term. And then I'll conclude with some conclusions, spelling out what I see as some of the project's major contributions. So first I want to turn to an overview of the project. I have to show a lot of maps when I talk about the Aral Sea because it's a place that is off the mental map of many people in the West. It's located between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, as you can see from that map. That map, I should clarify, is prior to the Aral Sea's 1960 retreat. So you'll see the picture looks quite different by the time we get up to today. The Aral Sea is technically actually not a sea. It is an endoheric lake, or a lake with no outflow, and it was once the world's fourth largest body of water, as I mentioned. The sea begins to shrink dramatically in the 1960s when Moscow diverts the rivers that fed the sea for cotton production. The desiccation of the sea continues into the late Soviet era, and by the late 1980s, the sea had split into two bodies of water, the North Aral Sea and the South Aral Sea. And you can see this comes from an Encyclopedia Britannica approximation of the changes that happen to the sea. And you can just see from this particular slide how dramatic it is, the shrinkage of the sea. By some estimates, by the late Soviet period, the sea had lost a volume of water equivalent to draining both Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. As a result of the sea's declining water levels, the climate and ecology of the surrounding region changes. The people who live near the sea begin to experience a dramatic increase in health problems. The sea's vibrant fishing industry comes to a halt, and this is the point at which these very striking and emblematic images begin to circulate. They become powerful symbols of Soviet decline and crimes against nature. And I find actually many in the West, at least, some people have vaguely heard of the sea, but if they haven't heard of the sea, they've often seen these photos because these photos are so striking. They began to circulate very widely, I think, in the 1990s, when people were particularly anxious to condemn the Soviet Union for particular crimes, environmental crimes. In Moscow, the decline in the Aral Sea's water levels was something that was discussed over many decades. Experts weighed the need to boost cotton production against the ecological effects that further irrigation could provoke. Under General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev, Soviet water experts revived an idea first advanced by Russian imperial planners, and that idea was to divert water, Siberian water south to Central Asia over a distance of 1,500 miles to save the sea. Initial work begins on the project, but the project met with controversy, and eventually under Gorbachev, the river diversion scheme is abandoned. With the Soviet collapse in 1991, the newly independent states of Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan inherit this pressing environmental problem, the collapse of the Aral Sea. But one interesting development is that we see two very different outcomes. Today, water levels have been partially restored in the North Aral Sea. The North Aral Sea is the Kazakhstani side of the sea, in part due to a World Bank-sponsored effort to construct a dam. You can see a picture of this dam here. But the South Aral Sea on the Uzbekistani side has continued its decline, and people in the region suffer disproportionately from health problems. Despite the Aral Sea's clear importance for our understanding of water use and the nature of the late Soviet era, there is at present no detailed scholarly account by a historian of the causes and consequences of its disappearance, which is very striking. The gap is due in part, I would say, to the fact that the bulk of this crisis takes part in the late Soviet era, and this, of course, is an era that my field, the Soviet field, has yet to fully explore. But we might also point to other factors that have contributed to the marginalization of the Aral Sea story. These include a tendency to sideline the stories of nomadic people. So many of the people who lived around the sea on both what becomes the Kazakhstani side and the Uzbekistani side, many of those people were nomadic, and they're nomadic up until the 1940s when they're violently settled. Another factor that we might point to is a relatively late adoption of environmental history within the Russian and Soviet field. Another factor that we might point to is even a lingering Eurocentrism within the field of Soviet history, which has tended to focus on the Soviet Union's West. Historians in Central Asia have also not focused on the issue of the Aral Sea, in part because it's not something that fits neatly into a national narrative, and I'll explain that more right now. So here you can see, and I apologize for my sketchy drawing here. I took that red magic marker and made that circle, but I'll explain why I did that. So the Soviet definition of the boundaries of the disaster from 1989 is a disaster zone that encompasses actually 3 different countries. And this disaster zone is still the one used by international agencies and the surrounding countries today. The disaster zone is known as the Pre-Aral, literally at the Aral. They took an older geographic term that had been used by Russian geographers, and they used it as the term that would designate the disaster zone. And it's a region that encompasses basically the northern part of Turkmenistan, Dashavuz Oblast. It encompasses in Uzbekistan, the Karakalpak ASSR and Khwarezm Oblast. And then it also encompasses Kizil-Orda Oblast in Kazakhstan. And if you find a map of this disaster zone, please send it to me because I have yet to actually find a map of the disaster zone. That's why I actually had to take the red magic marker here and circle it for you here, so you get a sense of the expanse of the Pre-Aral. You'll notice a couple things I want to point out about the disaster zone. This is not obviously a neat concentric circle. If I'd drawn a perfect circle, it should have gone further north. But one factor in the disaster becomes that winds blow to the south and to the southwest. So the regions further north are actually not as affected as places like Turkmenistan. You'll also notice that it's a pretty big circle there, right? And so, of course, there's debate and speculation about precisely how many people the disaster affected, but some people say that it affected the health of more than 5 million people. What more broadly was the history of this region of this pre-Aral? Well, first, it's a peripheral region. I think you noticed that from looking at the map. The Aral Sea itself is located at the edge or the boundary, the periphery of two vast republics, Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. And then the disaster itself also comes to affect the periphery of a third major republic, Turkmenistan. So it's sort of at the meeting point of all these different peripheries. The Aral Sea itself becomes a place of exile in the Russian and Soviet eras. There are deported people, special settlers who are sent there. It also becomes a place of experimentation. So in the late 1940s, the Soviets construct a biological weapons testing facility on an island in the Aral Sea, what is called Vozorozhdeniya Island, Resurrection Island. And during the Cold War, anthrax, smallpox, plague, and other agents were tested there. And I will get back to that point later in my talk. Some of my students love to remind me that if you know the video game Call of Duty, that island features in it. So just a fun fact. Today, many of those exiled who were exiled there, including Russian settlers, have left. But of course, many people remain. And predominantly the people who remain are Little Horde Kazakhs on the Kazakhstani side of the sea, and Karakalpaks, who are a Turkic-speaking ethnic group on the Uzbekistani side. And I point that out because these people are often perceived as marginal within their respective societies today. And I think that in turn has made the crisis even less likely to be picked up by, say, local historians who are tasked with constructing nation-building narratives. My study will explore the causes and consequences of the Aral Sea disaster. I'm planning on using archival sources and published sources like Soviet scientific journals, as well as conducting oral history interviews. The study will integrate both Russian and Turkic language sources, and I'm planning on conducting research for the project in Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and Russia. The last two, of course, are if political conditions permit, which of course, in the case of Russia, they do not right now. But I do have ideas for workarounds if I'm not able to conduct research in either Russia or Turkmenistan. The fact that my study does not adopt a national framework, but rather scrutinizes the entire Aral Sea disaster zone is really one of the crucial organizing principles of my study. So I'm returning again to this map. When scholars have looked at the sea, they have tended to focus on one side or the other. But exactly how the sea got broken down along national lines, how we see one side becoming Uzbek and the other side becoming Kazakh, and why we see such very different outcomes on the Uzbekistani side versus the Kazakhstani side is a really crucial element of what I'm interested in exploring. The conventional answer, the easy answer, the non-historian answer to these national differences is that the Kazakhs built a dam after the Soviet collapse and the Uzbeks did not. And in fact, I've been given that answer. Well, it's very easy. You know, the Uzbeks built a dam and, the Kazakhs built a dam and that's why. But of course, as a historian, I believe that the differences between these two sides have longer roots. The answer isn't so simple as the construction of a dam. I already have a few working theories as to why we see such differences, and I'm glad to talk about them in the Q&A if there's interest. In addition to adopting a geographic framing that steps beyond the national, I'm also adopting a longue durée approach. For many, the Aral Sea's decline has come to function as a warning about the deleterious effects of socialism on the environment. A World Bank report from 1999, for instance, characterizes the Aral Sea as an issue, quote, left over from the communist era, end quote. The partial restoration of water levels on the Kazakhstani side after the construction of a World Bank-sponsored dam in 2005, meanwhile, has been celebrated as a feat of international intervention. To date, this narrative, one of Soviet failure redeemed by heroic Western involvement, has absolutely dominated the way that this catastrophe has been portrayed. But even if you have a quick look, and I'll return now to this Encyclopedia Britannica shot here, Even if you have a quick look at time series photos from the 1960s to today, you see that last one, 1987, 1999 to the present day. What happened? Clearly, there's been enormous water loss after the Soviet collapse. So to say that this is just simply a Soviet story, this doesn't make sense. And it also doesn't make sense if we look at other metrics beyond water loss, if we look at public health indicators and so on. Clearly, in many senses, the crisis actually became worse. To correct the tendency to view the Aral Sea disaster purely through a Soviet lens, my project will follow the Aral Sea's transformation over the course of the 20th century. It traces how various states from the Russian Empire to the Soviet state to the independent nations of Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan sought to manage the sea and its environs. I also plan to work in the archives of international organizations like the World Bank to understand the post-Soviet part of the story, particularly how and why international organizations were unable to resolve this disaster. As you can tell from the beginning of my talk, this crisis is still very much ongoing today. So here in this particular slide, I've given you a tentative chapter outline of my book project. As you can see, I start with the Russian Empire. The heart of the book in particular will deal with the late Soviet period, and it will also go up to the post-Soviet period. And in the remainder of my talk today, I'll focus on one piece of the story, and it's a piece that I believe will probably end up fitting into chapter 5. So for much of the late Soviet period, the retreat of the Aral Sea, like many other ecological problems, was a partially forbidden topic. It was acknowledged by scientists and bureaucrats in internal communications. It regularly appears as an issue in the vernacular language literature of the region. And this is an area where writers often had greater flexibility to explore topics in a way that they couldn't in the Russian language media. But by the late 1980s, as Gorbachev's program of glasnost, or openness, began to introduce new themes into the public discourse, the Aral Sea disaster began to be openly discussed in newspapers and other public forums. Local residents, as well as bureaucrats on the ground, came to view the dust storms, as well as other changes associated with the sea retreat, as a peculiar form of seasickness. Kazakhstan's Minister of Health, whom I quoted here, he refers to this illness as the Aral syndrome, syndrome Arala. And I adopt this term as a kind of framing mechanism to encapsulate the array of environmental and social ailments that begin to become associated with the sea's retreat. As the health minister explains in an interview, there was a direct link between the health of the population and the health of the sea. Quote, "The sicker the sea gets, the worse the climate gets, and the sicker the population gets," end quote. I don't know how the health minister came to use this phrase, Aral syndrome, but he's a health official, so I'm guessing perhaps that his use of this term syndrome was deliberate. A syndrome refers to a complex of medical symptoms. When scientists identify a causative agent for these findings, physicians refer to it as a disease. In the late Soviet era, I argue the Aral syndrome never became transformed into a disease. The primary cause of this wide-ranging malady, an obsession with cotton, remained mostly unacknowledged and unaddressed. The Soviet collapse in 1991 fails to dislodge cotton from its central place in the region's economy. With the dissolution of the Soviet medical system in the early 1990s, the spread of the Aral syndrome would intensify. So now I'll turn to the context of the late Soviet era to explain what I mean by that term and what kinds of changes people saw and how they reacted. By the mid-1960s, many people came to remark with alarm on the shifts that they saw in the sea and surrounding regions. But it's important, before going into those changes, to say that actually environmental change is a really important and regular feature of this region. Rainfall patterns could vary widely from year to year. The channels of the sea's southern delta shifted frequently due to the buildup of sediment in its waterways. The sea's water levels were rarely stable, and actually, if you look deeper into human history, the sea has also gone through other retreats in the past. Russian imperial officials, you'll notice I have a Russian imperial map up here. I do that because they often got into furious debates. They bitterly complained that they couldn't even map the southern delta of the sea, actually, because of the frequency of environmental change The deltas, little riverways would fill up with silt and with sand, and it would kind of change the maps that they had produced, and these would become outdated. But even within this context of ongoing environmental change, observers began to see the changes that the sea was undergoing beginning in the 1960s as distinct. Prior to this period, the Aral Sea had been regarded as the most important fishing body in Central Asia. It normally yields a catch of around 30 to 40,000 tons. This is roughly 5 to 7% of the Soviet Union's total inland fish catches. Roughly 60% of this catch comes from the south of the sea, what's the Uzbekistani side of the sea. Another 40% comes from the north of the sea, the Kazakhstani side. By the 1960s, however, this catch is dropping. In 1958, the North Sea yields a catch, that's the Kazakhstani side, they yield a catch of around 217,000 tons. That's a pretty normal year. In 1965, the catch dips to 146,000 tons. In 1968, to 101,000 tons. By 1969, Kazakhstan's deputy minister for fisheries reports with worry, quote, that the sea is losing its significance as a body of water for fishing. At this time, there's also a pronounced shift in the type of fish being caught in the sea. Sought after fish like carp, bream, and barbel, they had almost disappeared from the waters. By 1974, different species of fish become dominant predatory fish like asp and pipe perch, and they begin to constitute more than 60% of the catch. Officials saw several reasons for these shifts. Scientists with Kazakhstan Scientific Fisheries Research Institute notes that the retreat of the sea had actually eliminated a lot of the coastal zones where fish usually like to spawn. With no place to reproduce, their numbers had plummeted. Others pointed to the fact that the sea was becoming increasingly saline. So as it recedes, the waters became more brackish, and that threatened the survival of certain types of fish that could not survive in high saline environments. The Aral Sea is also an important place for muskrat farming. In the 1940s, muskrats are introduced to the Amu Darya Delta, that's the southern part of the sea from Canada. They make their homes in the thick stands of reeds that grew at the delta's mouth. They quickly acclimate to the delta's environment, and by the late 1940s, muskrat farms in the region deliver more than 1 million pelts a year to the state. But as the sea begins to dry up in the mid-1960s, the reeds in the delta, which are really important to these muskrats, both as a place to reproduce and also as a source of food, they begin to die off. They threaten the animal's survival. In what was once marshland, the soil becomes hard, and I'll show you a picture of what that looks like. For those of you maybe who are familiar with the American Southwest, some of these images might look familiar, and this is called tahiri, that's what it is called in Central Asia, but it bears a lot of similarities to, say, salt flats that you might see in the United States. In 1973, Georgy Nikolsky, a biologist who is chairman of the Soviet Union's Ecology Commission, reports grimly, quote, "At the present moment, the muskrat industry in the delta of the Amu Darya has almost collapsed," end quote. He also notes other significant climatic changes throughout the region. Previously, the Aral Sea had been a really important regulator of the region's climate. Winters, however, were now colder, summers hotter, the region's humidity had plummeted. Dust storms are showering surrounding areas with salt. Residents of a state farm describe the experience this way, quote, "When the wind blows from the sea, white pollen flies from the sky like snowflakes and burns the grass on the ground," end quote. Nikolsky predicts that the pace of environmental change would only accelerate in the coming years. He says, quote, "The continued fall of the level of the sea, if it will happen, will lead to more and greater climatic shifts and exposure of salty land." And he argues that these changes are going to affect not only the districts that border the sea, but also the cotton growing districts further south. Prior to the sea's retreat, Aralsk, so I'm sorry I wish I had better maps. Maps is a really big problem for this project because I have to spend so much time looking at maps, and it's a region that's unfamiliar for many people. But if you see at the very top of your screen, for those of you who have good eyesight, you might be able to see at the very top of your screen a town called Aralsk there. that is a port on the Kazakhstani side of the sea. Here you can see this map is useful because it has the current shape of the Aral Sea or its remains today, but it also has the original sort of 1960 boundaries of the sea. So you can see from the original 1960 boundaries that Aralsk was in fact a port. It was on the Aral Sea. And I bring this up because it played a really important role as a transportation artery. Aralsk is connected to Russia by a railway line, the Orenburg-Tashkent Railway that had been built in 1906. But the southern side of the sea, the Uzbekistani side, is not on the main railway line north. So the most efficient way actually to get goods from the southern half of the sea to Russia is to actually ship them, say from Oynak there, all the way across the sea to Aralsk, place them on railway cars headed north, and then goods coming from Russia to Central Asia take the same route, but in reverse. And this system is one of the ways that the Russian Empire and later the Soviet state acquires cotton from Central Asia and also supplies the region with grain. So Central Asian cotton from Uzbekistan, to a lesser extent Turkmenistan, it's actually transported on across the sea, loaded onto railway cars, and then grain takes the reverse. But by the 1970s, as I think you can see from this map, if you just imagine how the sea is retreating, Aralsk is once a port. It's no longer a port. It's no longer on the sea, actually. And so it's becoming increasingly difficult to transport goods across the sea. As well, across the region, residents find their way of life transformed. And again, I'm returning to these very striking images of ships stuck in the sand. Prior to the retreat, many villages on the northern bank of the sea were actually only connected to the sea by water. This was the way you reached them. There were no roads directly out to them. They reached other places by water, and this is how they would get their supplies. They had no road access. But the decline in the sea's level meant that these villages are actually now stranded more than 15 to 20 kilometers from shore. Alexander Ishkov, who's the head of the Soviet Union's fishing ministry, detailed this in a letter to the Soviet Union's Council of Ministers. They have no employment. The sea is gone. Their homes, which were buried in sand, actually covered in sand by these constant dust storms, they effectively become islands in this dried up seabed. And because they're cut off from both water access and they never had road access, they have no way of getting basic necessities like food or medicine. These had always been transported by water. Due to a drop in the region's groundwater table, many did not have clean drinking water, and this becomes one of the really also major issues in the Aral Sea story. Aral Sea residents were faced with a threat of eviction. Ishkov wrote with some poignancy, quote, "from those places where their fathers and grandfathers lived," end quote. Soviet officials and residents themselves began to face very difficult questions about how to resettle these families, how to predict the pace of environmental change. Should we wait? Should we resettle them now? Should we see where it goes? It's at this point they also consider a number of ways to halt the sea's decline. The most prominent proposal is a massive river diversion project developed under Brezhnev that I've already mentioned. This was to divert a lot of the rivers in Siberia to Central Asia. The idea sparks a lot of controversy. As I mentioned, it becomes bogged down in long-running debate. And many, particularly in Central Asia, who actually followed this debate, were convinced that any change, if it came, any movement on this issue, would actually come too late to preserve key elements of the sea's industry, such as fishing. Officials understood the primary reason for the sea's retreat to be an increase in the amount of irrigated land in the region. But a focus on agricultural production, what the head of Kizilorda's health ministry labeled a mentality of, quote, cotton as white gold, rice as silver, continues to drive the irrigation of new lands. To make up for the decline in the Aral Sea's catch, officials actually begin to develop so-called fish farms in different bodies of water in Central Asia. These fish farms operate in newly created reservoirs as well as bodies of water formed from the runoff from irrigation. So on this map, you can see some of these new bodies of water that begin to appear actually as they increase irrigation. You can see Lake Saregamash and Lake Aydar over there. But fishing proves to be very challenging in these reservoirs and new bodies of water. A lot of them are heavily salinated, they're contaminated with agricultural chemicals. Fish couldn't thrive in these waters. Moreover, It wasn't just the Aral Sea that was disappearing, numerous observers noted. As the use of water for agriculture had increased throughout Central Asia, the majority of lakes in the region, quote, have become shallower and have lost their former importance for fishing, and some bodies of water have dried up entirely, end quote, an official in Kazakhstan wrote in 1969. The Aral Sea's problems were actually mirrored to a certain extent elsewhere. In the archives, discussion of the medical problems that people near the Aral Sea experienced appears with the late 1980s and glasnost. I'm going to keep digging on this point because I am quite certain that if you look closely at some of the files for earlier periods, and I can already see hints that party officials really knew about these health problems much earlier than that era, than the late 1980s. But it is really by the late 1980s, the health problems of people near the Aral Sea are in full view in the archives and newspapers. A 1986 report by Kazakhstan's Academy of Sciences on Kizilorda Oblast is particularly damning. It notes that there had been a dramatic jump in the number of people ill in the last 10 years. That people sick with liver and kidney diseases had tripled, while the number ill with gastrointestinal problems and heart problems had doubled. Beginning in 1974, the author wrote, infectious diseases in the oblast had taken on, quote, the form of a pandemic. Typhus, typhoid, and hepatitis can be found in all population points in the oblast. Other illnesses are also of concern, the author detailed, quote, the incidence of tuberculosis remains on a high level without the tendency to drop in contrast to other oblasts of the Republic, end quote. These illnesses, many observers concluded, disproportionately affect women and children, and similar problems are mirrored throughout the pre-Aral zone. For some, the problems with human health in the region are not actually that difficult to explain. The head of Kizilorda's health ministry explains the problems in this way. He says, quote, the country, and here I'll show you the image that applies, the country at the mouth of the river drinks water, and the country at the foot of it drinks poison. So to explain his comment a little bit more is what he's getting at is the particular geography of the region. He's referring to the fact that Aral Sea residents are downstream. So there are two major water sources for the sea, which hopefully you can see on this map, the Amu Darya and the Sir Darya. And they wind their way through several different countries before they spill out into the Aral Sea. The Aral Sea is the terminus. The Amu Darya is formed, of course, on the border between Afghanistan and Tajikistan. The Sir Darya originates in the Tian Shan Mountains in Kyrgyzstan and eastern Uzbekistan. So if you put anything upstream in these rivers, a lot of that eventually finds its way into the Aral Sea. So the health minister's statement, it has obviously a certain dramatic flair, right? But he's actually right. There was poison in the waters that fed the sea. A 1986 report found traces of the insecticide DDT in water sources throughout Kizilorda Oblast. The authors concluded that DDT had been used further upstream in an effort to boost cotton production and fight malarial mosquitoes. A 1987 report for the Soviet Union's Council of Ministers on the Pre-Aral noted that waters throughout the region had been polluted. Factories and apartment blocks upstream dumped waste directly into the Amu Darya and Sir Darya. Pesticides, defoliants, and chemical fertilizers could also be found in the region's water supply due to runoff from agricultural sources. Fish was previously a staple of the region's diet. It's now unsafe to eat because it swam in such polluted waters. The Kizilorda health minister described seeing seagulls die after drinking contaminated water from the region's rivers. Dead fish floats across the surface of the sea. A 1986 report by Kazakhstan's Academy of Sciences on Kizilorda Oblast found concentrations of the pesticides DDT and DDE in 3 different types of fish in the Sir Darya River. Quote, in the majority of cases, the authors detailed, these materials have the effect of accumulating in the liver and other organs and leave the human body very slowly. Therefore, they may cause irreparable harm at any concentration, end quote. Other aspects of the region's food supply are also threatened. Environmental conditions had actually affected agriculture and animal husbandry throughout the Pre-Aral. Some food crops failed to grow. They produced lower than normal harvest due to a lack of water. Animals like cows or sheep, they have less to eat, and this is a problem that's further heightened by the increasing acreage given over to cotton. The health problems of people in the Pre-Aral are also compounded by the region's lack of infrastructure. On the Uzbekistani side, for instance, less than 5% of the population has indoor plumbing. There are problems with medical care as well, a severe shortage of doctors. Medical facilities in the region are limited. They're poorly supplied with the equipment needed to treat people. Hospitals are overflowing. As Kazakhstan's health minister wrote, quote, "The space given to one hospital bed is 3 times less than the norm. And sometimes there are no hospital beds whatsoever," end quote. There are also other theories about the origins of the region's health problems. You will recall Resurrection Island, which I mentioned at the beginning. Well, as the sea retreats, what happens? This top secret biological weapons facility comes closer to shore. In the 1970s, the island was linked to a smallpox outbreak. Some speculate that in recent years, animals and people came into contact with diseases produced in the facility and spread them on shore, sickening the local population. The most insidious theory blames the health problems on the behavior of local residents. The area around the Aral Sea had some of the highest birth rates in the Soviet Union. This baby boom, some Soviet officials argued, explained the region's poverty, poor health, and water shortages. The solution to the Aral Sea disaster, they argued, was actually to bring down the region's birth rates. And you can even, I was just really struck by this when I began reading the very voluminous scientific literature on the Aral Sea. You can still find some of these theories, so-called theories, in leading works by leading Russian geographers and so on about the Aral Sea. It's very striking, it's very pervasive. In 1983, a far-reaching scandal erupts in Uzbekistan. It came to be known as the Cotton Affair, and it brought to light some of the extensive corruption and greed connected with the growth of the cotton industry in Uzbekistan. Moscow accuses officials in Uzbekistan of falsifying cotton harvests. Sharaf Rashidov, who you can see there, who is the leader of Uzbekistan and the target of some of these investigations, he dies under mysterious circumstances. Large numbers of officials in Uzbekistan are purged. They're charged with bribe taking, the theft of state funds, and lost in its own role was Moscow's own role in this crisis. In 1980, the Republic had raised its cotton production targets to over 6 million tons. This is a policy that was brought about in part by Moscow's continued pressure for growth in cotton yields. The Cotton Affair is often seen as separate from the Aral Sea story, but the two are interlinked. It illustrates that the Aral Sea disaster was still understood as a syndrome in the late Soviet era, not a disease, where one could identify a causative agent for the malady. There was not yet the real possibility to question the central role of cotton in the making of the disaster. And so with that, I'll turn to the last and final part of my presentation. I'll talk a little bit about my conclusions and some of the interventions that so far I see the project making. So first, this crisis, the Aral Sea crisis, that should be very evident from the slides I showed you at the beginning, it's still ongoing. Scientists continue to debate the strategies that they should take, from afforestation, the planting of trees, to the building of dams to address the drying up of the seabed. It's precisely because the topic has such immediate contemporary relevance that it interests me. My study, I hope, could offer solutions and best practices to address the Aral Sea crisis in the future, and I'm certainly interested in speaking beyond the academy with this book. Second, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has predicted that Central Asia will actually experience warming levels higher than the global mean in the future. So this is a region, Central Asia, that will be at the forefront of climate change, the forefront of discussions of what to do about it going forward. So I believe that the case of the Aral Sea can offer us crucial lessons for our own future, particularly as we begin to wrestle with similar issues in the United States. Here I'm thinking of issues like the drying up of Lake Mead in the southwest of the US, the drying up of the Great Salt Lake in Utah. We actually see somewhat very similar patterns actually happening, that rising salinity, species die off. If in the past we cast the Aral Sea as this aberrant, socialist example condemned to the past, I think if we look at what is going on around us now, we have to say absolutely that's not true. And in fact, there's probably a great deal that we can learn from the Aral Sea example. Third, and finally, I believe my study underscores the importance of finding more sustainable ways to produce cotton. There is a very large body of scholarship on the growth of the cotton industry, but as I began to to make my way through some of this, what has really surprised me is that it has paid very little attention to cotton's environmental impact. Cotton is a very thirsty crop. It's very, very water intensive. The form of cotton farming that is developed today and developed in part in the Soviet Union was also very pesticide intensive. And this literature has also, with only a few notable exceptions, neglected the story of socialism in cotton, concentrating largely on the capitalist world. But today, cotton production accounts for nearly 20% of worldwide pesticide use. Thousands of farmers sickened from these pesticides each year and die. Waterlogging and secondary salinization due to irrigation damage surrounding lands. Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan are a vital part of this system today. They are the world's 5th and 7th largest cotton producers. They are reliant on state-run systems of forced labor to grow and harvest cotton. Despite efforts to ban cotton from these countries for their labor practices, Uzbek and Turkmen cotton finds its way into US markets at actually the very clothes that we wear today. So the Aral Sea story, I would argue, remains with us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was perfectly timed. We're going to open up the floor now to questions. Professor Cameron. Yeah. Please.
Could you talk more about
Could you speak up a bit?
Could you talk more about this obsession with cotton? Because it seems like in multiple points throughout history, it's about cotton. And it's key thing that
Sure. So yeah, it's definitely a really important part of the story. And as you probably noticed from my chapter overview of the book, I actually have some chapters switch lenses actually from focusing on the Aral Sea itself to focusing on cotton production. And one of the major chapters of my book is on the construction of the Karakum Canal in Turkmenistan, which is generally recognized as one of the major drivers of the Aral Sea's collapse. So I think in the Soviet case, we see a really striking leap in cotton production. So what's interesting is just in the space of a few, in the space of decades, from say the 1960s to the 1980s, they bring their cotton production up enormously. By 1980, the Soviet Union is the world's 2nd largest cotton producer behind China. So I think that has actually largely been unrecognized in the literature. I think most of this cotton actually in the Soviet case is of poor quality, and it's produced mainly for domestic consumption. It's, as far as I understand it, so far a lot of it is not exported abroad. But I think in part in the Soviet case, it becomes, cotton becomes important to the Soviet Union's goal of being seen as self-sufficient and not dependent upon the capitalist world for raw materials.
Yes.
Thank you for this very interesting talk. So I have two questions. So the first one is related to what you said about the silencing of this whole history of the Aral Sea. And the question would be about environmental activism. So whether there are actually groups or there were groups on the ground that were, trying to somehow resist the politics, and if they were, how successful they were or they are. And the second question is about the bigger framing of the case. And I was thinking, because I'm not that familiar with the region, like to what extent, for example, in ethnographic literature, there is this kind of thinking about Aral Sea as some kind of shared cultural space, or whether we think about this, or whether like in the region it's forward more in this kind of very national terms. And I'm thinking more about, I don't know, I kept thinking about all this great literature on the Mediterranean, right? That the Mediterranean is kind of shared cultural space. I think that now there are these attempts to think about the Black Sea as this shared space. So I was thinking like to what extent something like this may trace in the case of Aral Sea or not really, or this is really this kind of very nationalized thinking about.
Thank you. So I take your second question first. It's a really interesting question. I have not come across that yet, but it may be that I'm simply not far enough in my research. That is also one reason why I really wanted to start this book in the Russian imperial period, was to actually trace the roots of that. I think the dividing up of the region into national lines was incredibly actually important, but it also papers over actually some other older ways that the region might have been seen. But I have not come across that in the sources that I have read yet so far. Thinking that it's kind of a shared space along the lines of these other bodies of water that you list, but I will certainly be attentive to it now that you've mentioned it. So silencing of the Aral Sea. So definitely I want, and in that chapter that I flagged, that's where I anticipate actually dealing with some moments of environmental activism. So as I mentioned, they have difficulties that you can't, this is not really an issue that you can openly talk about in full classrooms, although it does appear a lot in literature. One of the things that's really interested me so far is that the Aral Sea becomes an incredible site for cultural production. So literature, music, art, you can write a whole separate book, I'm convinced, on actually the Aral Sea as a site of cultural production. I can't do that because I have other problems I've got to deal with here, but I certainly think that it will form a major part in that chapter, those materials. But by the late 1980s, this activism does become more open, at least. So Gorbachev actually ends up coming to Tashkent in the late Soviet period. The Aral Sea is one of the issues that he's raised with him, and I think this is in part what leads to the declaration, the 1989 declaration of the Aral Sea as a disaster zone. Even by that point, the effects on the Uzbek side, the differences between the Kazakh and Uzbek side have become more apparent. This is also why I think that you can't say that the differences are just due to a dam that wasn't built until 2005, going back to the beginning of my talk. I don't actually think, it's interesting in the sources I've seen so far, people complain that, look, if an activist in Russia talks about Lake Baikal, for instance, the environmental problems with Lake Baikal, he is, welcome. People are happy that this issue is being brought up. But if an activist in Central Asia talks about the Aral Sea, they're branded as a nationalist. So I think one of the interesting issues to watch will also be, of course, the intertwining of nationalism and environmental activism. I definitely anticipate the book making some contribution to our understanding of the development of nationalism in the late Soviet era. I think in the case, you see a lot of, so another environmental issue that's going on at the same time in Central Asia is the Semipalatinsk nuclear testing site in Kazakhstan. So there's some crossover actually between some of the activists who are involved in the Semipalatinsk nuclear testing site and the Aral Sea. So that's also another interesting area. But I don't think you would classify them as really having successes until really the period of Kazakhstan, so quite late, I would argue.
Can we have Carl Apun, please, who I see on the screen? Carl, can you hear me?
I can hear you, and I just unmuted. I'll briefly turn my camera on, or maybe I won't. Okay, there I am. Okay, so thanks a lot for the talk. It was very interesting. I have many questions, but I'll limit myself to two. And one you sort of alluded to, which was about cultural production and literary production, because it strikes me that you started with these anecdotes about the dust storms, and a lot of the parallels that you pointed to were things more recent environmental disasters in the U.S. West, but the obvious thing is the Dust Bowl. That's the obvious parallel. And since the Dust Bowl also produced some of the great modernist literature of the 20th century, like The Grapes of Wrath, but not only, I'm just wondering if that, in any of this cultural production, if that is explicitly referred to. If so, that would be interesting. If not, why not? And then the other question, that's sort of my pseudo Kate Brown question. Second question is, Kazakhstan is where the bubonic plague bacillus was first actually isolated and identified. because there's a strong argument that that is actually where it came from originally. And I'm just wondering if among the many different kinds of disease events that accompany the retreat of the Aral Sea, if bubonic plague figures in there at all. And if not, that's fine. But I was just sort of, that was something that sprang to mind.
Thanks for your question. So the Dust Bowl, yes, actually one of the reasons why you're absolutely right that this is a really important parallel. One of the reasons why actually I wanted to start with these images of people enduring dust storms and so on is that I recently, I taught a course with my students, a seminar, Natural Disasters, and we read Donald Worster's Dust Bowl. And I was really struck actually by how evocative his depictions of dust are and what it meant actually to live through these dust storms and how horrible it was and how people coped and how the effects it had on their mentality. So actually I even looked closely at that book as I was trying to write some of these sections. You asked about whether people refer to the Dust Bowl, Central Asians in the region. No. I have not found any instances of that. I'm guessing it's people in Central Asia at the time were simply not aware of what happened in the Dust Bowl. I don't think it's something that they had the ability to learn about. So in the question of bubonic plague, this is something that is also of interest to me. You might be interested to know that there is actually a scholar, Susan Jones. She's a historian of science who's working on the issue of the Dust Bowl in Central Asia. She's a historian of science at the University of Minnesota. So she is studying this issue, and actually recently met with her. She gave me some great leads actually to look for where to look for instances of the bubonic plague and the Aral Sea. But at least in the sources that I've come across so far, I've not found any instances of the plague. That doesn't mean, however, that it didn't happen. I think one of the things I tried to stress to you in my talk is that it's as one might anticipate, a lot of the files for the late, and this is something I felt when I was working in archives, a lot of the files for the late Soviet era are scrubbed. And this was, these medical problems are not something that they wanted people to know about. And so you have to get a bit creative actually in how you research them. So she gave me some wonderful leads on how to do that, suggestions, where to look in things like the scientific grade literature for instances of outbreaks and so on. So I got these leads from her about a week ago, but I haven't yet tracked them down. So hopefully in a couple months, I'll have a better answer for you on that question.
Quick question about the Aral syndrome.
Yeah.
I'm wondering to what extent you think that they always knew it was cotton and didn't talk about it, or to what extent this is the process of discovery of kind of putting two together. My understanding is that in like similar cases with pesticides in the US, it actually took them a little while to figure out that this was going on. So what is your take on
By them? Who do you mean? Do you
the
mean
specialists who are writing about it, the people who are, the health specialists, the scientists who are dealing with it, what extent it's kind of like, okay, this weird thing is happening and they immediately know it's cotton, or does it actually take them a while to figure it out?
I think it might depend. So far in the research I've noticed so far, I noticed a split between what the health specialists are saying and what, say, some of these water experts are saying. And the I think there are some institutional fighting going on, shall we say, between some of the health experts who complain that they're always in last place in terms of funding and so on, and some of these water experts. I think it's actually perfectly clear to most people as these problems emerge what the cause is. Whether they entirely anticipated the dimension of these problems is another question, and I don't think they did. There were a lot of debates about, basically they knew that if they were going to up cotton production, that the sea would shrink. One of the problems that they didn't anticipate is just how much of the seabed exactly would come off. And so what starts to happen is some of the more toxic chemicals at the bottom of the seabed also start to come off. And this was something that they did not anticipate. I also think they did not anticipate the particular ways that some of these herbicides and pesticides got into the groundwater. So for instance, the groundwater table begins to drop as the Aral Sea begins to disappear. And so people just start drinking like from streams and from other polluted sources I think also, many of these people, for instance, might have kept things like kitchen gardens. And these kitchen gardens also begin to fail as the weather worsens, as the climate worsens, all of these things. So I think there's a lot of dimensions of the problem that they actually did not, think through when they upped cotton production.
Yeah, I'll ask my question.
Sure.
Which is, Carl said that he was asking his version of a Kate Brown question, and I'm going to ask mine. Which is that one of the things, I taught a course on just one not natural disaster, Chernobyl, last semester. And so when you were talking about the island and the testing, that was front of mind for me. And I was thinking about one of the arguments that Kate Brown makes about, how to put it, the Soviet engagement with certainly the technology, with nuclear technology, and the specificities of technology transfer from the environment in which nuclear technology is initially created to the Soviet side. And I'm curious about, so one of the arguments that, to my mind at least, comes out of that is that we get this kind of duality for thinking about nuclear power in the Soviet project as being, on the one hand, a universal phenomenon that is universally dangerous and can lead to these disastrous outcomes by the nature of the thing itself. And on the other hand, there's a very particular Soviet story that we tell about the Chernobyl in particular, but these other disasters as well. I'm curious whether you think about, or whether you think it's possible to think about cotton in the same way, that the story that we're learning, thanks to you, about the Aral Sea and its management and its relationship with the cotton industry is one that is specific, or rather, in what ways would you say at this very early date, at this very early moment in your research, that you're seeing dimensions of it that appear specific to the Soviet management, and in what way are you seeing these through lines that are phenomenal? That's not the way phenomenology actually works, but that are connected to the phenomenon itself. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I'm really, if anyone also knows of other, I'm always ask everyone for literature on environmental effects of cotton, because it's actually not very well developed. So if others know of that, I would be really happy to have those references. So, I think obviously there's kind of a general story here that cotton is a very water intensive crop, a very labor intensive crop, and so that is kind of a shared story, right? That it is, and it's also become a very pesticide intensive crop, particularly in its modern in farming incarnation. And so I think that's the commonality here. In terms of the specific, obviously one of the big issues here is that you have massive environmental change overlapping with massive political change, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. So disentangling these environmental and political changes also becomes very challenging. I gave a little talk the other day in Maryland about climate refugees and climate change. And I was on a roundtable and I was saying, well, in the case of the Aral Sea, it becomes, what do we mean by this category of climate refugee? Because many of these people are also leaving due to this massive upheaval. So I think obviously that the Aral Sea's demise overlapped with these massive political changes is a really important that we see. First, it's a socialist story, and then it's a capitalist story. And so I think that's also a really important facet of the Aral Sea story. In terms of the Soviet system, and cotton farming, one of my hunches kind of going into this is maybe there's something specific about, the Soviet Union's production of cotton, and specifically the setting of production targets, that there was a kind of rigidity maybe baked into the system that was, say, less responsive than you might find in other cases. So those are some of the kind of working theories, if you will, that I have so far.
Yeah, it's a question about how the different countries tackle the issue that you mentioned a little bit at the beginning. Because this summer I was in Uzbekistan, I wasn't in Kazakhstan, but I met people. Yeah. I meet people from there working also in community-based tourism and all these new projects. But what I don't know, this is my question. What I didn't realize and find out is the way Uzbekistan was kind of not considering the issue because a minority lives there, it's a different ethnic group, yes or no?
So you pointed to what I think is a really important factor in the story here is that, again, problem of math, so I'm not sure if it came out that well in my talk, but so the Karakalpaks, they're a different Turkic-speaking ethnic group, and they live inside Uzbekistan, and they have their own, autonomous republic within Uzbekistan. They never got their own actual republic during the Soviet period, and I do think because so I think we can argue both groups have been marginalized. Little horde Kazakhs, Kazakh society is divided into one of three hordes. I think we can argue maybe tentatively that little horde Kazakhs have been marginalized in terms of their integration in the Soviet period, but they have not been marginalized in the same way that Karakalpaks have been marginalized in Uzbekistani society today. The fact that the Karakalpak issue is still seen as such a hot button issue. We saw that this summer, with the demonstrations in Karakalpakstan. I do think that's a really, really important factor to the story, and also why we see really different outcomes. I see this project hopefully making a contribution to our knowledge of non-titular groups in the Soviet period, which is not an area that has been as well developed as these stories of the titular groups. But I think on the Kazakh side, they want to very much depict it as a success story. It's probably, I think, because the situation is worse on the Uzbekistani side, it's more prominent on the Uzbek side. In Turkmenistan, very sensitive issue. It's actually been one of the great challenges of this project to find out what on earth is even going on there. And I think that will be a challenge going forward as well.
Yes, Anna.
Since so much of this information is censored, what were one of the most creative ways you had to use to get this information?
Let's see. Well, I think talking to people is one way around it. I haven't actually done I'm planning to do oral history interviews, as I mentioned, on both sides of the sea. And I did that in purpose because I really wanted to get at local understandings of what happened, because I feel like in the literature that we have so far on the Aral Sea, that's what's really been marginalized, because a lot of the literature has been produced by people who are not experts in Central Asia. They don't know the regional languages. And I really wanted to bring out, and also a lot of the literature is very orientalizing. It sort of, gives the impression that these people of societies in collapse. And I really wanted to fight against that. So that's one of my major plans. And I think there's an awful lot you can find out by talking to people. I've actually did just kind of some interviews informally when I was in Almaty this summer, because there are a lot of Aral Sea residents who left as these environmental changes occurred, and I just talked to them when I was in Almaty. They were the people, for instance, who told me about, oh gosh, it's that island, Resurrection Island, that's to blame for some of the health problems. I don't know if that's true. That may not even be the point about whether it's true or not. But I just found these. I found this oral history in particular to be a really interesting way to get more at local understandings and to get around the problem. Literature, again, as I mentioned, becomes a particularly vernacular language literature, so stuff that's not in Russian because it wasn't policed as much. I think this also is a really interesting source and a way to get around some of these issues. I would say, though, still it's actually kind of remarkable what you can get at in the archives. The files that I was quoting from you, most of them, I'm the first person to look at them. And so it is still kind of astonishing, actually, what you can just find in the archives as well.
Yeah, I have a comment and a question there about the archives. What are the sources that you're using?
Yeah.
Are they Moscow-based? In Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, you're looking at health officials and so on. And if you are using, well, you said you're gonna conduct oral interviews, but I'm interested on what locals say about the disaster and the reasons for that. How they interpret that story. I think the question about this sort of local subculture that transcends the national borders is really important and interesting, and the groups that live around that, and what kind of
their ideas about the sea and their mythology about the sea.
Yeah.
Would be incorporated. So this is one, and the second, when you talked about the dust storms, actually I thought about China.
Mm-hmm.
And also images of dust storm in China, which in the 2010s, I guess, became so visible in the major news outlets. And then you talked about you kind of referenced what's happening in the US, and that your general sort of argument to go against this narrative of the Soviet failure. I mean, the disaster is the result of the fail of the Soviet modernization or industrialization. So I thought maybe it's going far from your project, but if you're going against this narrative of the Soviet failure, maybe it's good also to see China in that sense. Well, you said the story is not just socialist story, it's a capitalism. And considering where China is going to and how it's developing, maybe it would be a kind of a help for you to think about the Soviet project.
Thank you. Yes, I actually just made a connection with an anthropologist who works in China on dust storms. So I haven't actually read his work, but I just made a connection. So definitely it's on my radar screen. I just haven't.
Because the disasters happened there actually after since the late 1990s.
Yes. Right? And it's in part, I mean, of course, there's a shared sort of environmental features of parts of this region, and that also, helps explain some of it. But definitely, it's on my radar screen. So archives, what have I worked in so far? So I've only worked in the Kazakhstani archives so far, just in the central archives. For this project, I plan to work in archives in Almaty, on the Kazakh side, so the capital archives, but then also archives, right next to the sea in Aral Sea. There's an archive there, and on the Uzbek side in Tashkent, and then also in Nukus in the archives. I will try to work in Turkmenistan in the archives. I have my doubts about whether I will get a visa or get in, but I still feel it's possible to do the project without going to Turkmenistan. Obviously, it was originally my plan to work in the archives in Russia as well, but I'm not sure that's going to happen. But I do think there are ways of working around it. And so in the Kazakh archive so far, I have worked in the files of the fishing ministry in particular. That's where I got a lot of really fascinating materials. In the health ministry archives, this is again what makes me think that things are scrubbed. Nothing. No mention of Aral Sea. No mention when all these health problems with children are raging, nothing. So I really sense from that okay, the files are scrubbed and I have to be creative actually. And I do believe, I know this from my Famine project, that when you don't find it one place, of course you look another. And so that's just my first trip of many. But also in the Ministry of Soviets, also that collection, I definitely found materials as well. And also for this particular talk too, there's a lot of published material, essays, recollections, newspaper clippings that begin to come out in Glasnost. So I used that as well. So how people interpret the sea, this is also interesting. I think today it is, and again, this draws really from my impressions from visiting Kazakhstan, because I have been to Uzbekistan, but not to research on this project. On the Kazakh side, at least, the Aral Sea, if I compare to my first project on the famine, it is not perceived as a national problem in the same way. In fact, people thought that my choice of topic when I was in Almaty this summer, they thought it was very strange, very odd. I got told that I had picked a very narrow topic. And they don't really see it as a historical topic actually either. This is something that, scientists explore, that geographers explore. This is not at all a historical topic. And I don't think because it's something that spans the region, it's just not something that is on the radar screen of Kazakhs in the same way, although I definitely did talk to some people, particularly people from the region, who were very eager, that someone wanted to tell this story. I definitely did get mentions, and this, of course, I think will figure into the project as I go further, of regional rivalries and national rivalries. So one explanation, local understandings of the project, when I would talk to some, Kazakh scholars or Kazakhs about the Aral Sea, they'd say, well, it's Uzbek's fault. There's this historic rivalry between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan for regional supremacy. And the Kazakhs, for instance, Kazakhs say things like, well, if we hadn't lost so many people in the famine, our population would now exceed Uzbekistan. So they are the traditional rivals for regional supremacy, and they blame the Aral Sea's collapse. Some people do in part because they say, look, it was the Uzbeks who boosted cotton production. Kazakhstan is not a major cotton producer in the same way that Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan are. So they see the fact that, quote, the Uzbeks boosted cotton production, it's their fault, and this led to the Aral Sea's demise. So that's definitely one explanation that I've gotten so far.
Thank you so much for your talk. So you mentioned that there is kind of this water stream issue with like pollution from upstream getting carried downstream. You also mentioned that the area is kind of divided. So I was wondering if the water stream is like divided into different like regions right now, and how like intervention efforts are dealing with that. Whether the river is studied as like an entity or whether they have to deal with cross-border issues, and how you're planning to deal with that in your research.
Yeah, so thank you. Obviously one of the challenges for this project is that, clearly the story of the Aral Sea is, these water issues start in the mountains, right? Beyond the area of the specific disaster zone that I'm looking at. I felt just for the purposes of making the project doable, I couldn't go to all these other places. And then I wanted to concentrate on the story of what happened to people in the disaster zone. But obviously I'm going to clearly have to touch upon water issues beyond that. But in regards to the specifics, so, one of the interesting things that happens is after previously these water issues had been managed by a single entity, the Soviet Union. Now there were, of course, national spats and dimensions, tensions over water issues, but then the Soviet Union collapses. And then all of these water issues have to be managed by different countries. And that continues to be a source of major tension today. So soon after the Soviet collapse, they formed an agency, the International Fund for Saving the Aral Sea, which attempts to manage the Aral Sea as a problem across these 5 different countries. And actually I met with a lot of the people from that fund. They've been really helpful to me in giving me contacts and so on. But I have heard, actually, I just heard recently that Kyrgyzstan, for instance, withdrew from this fund, actually, I think this fall. So it is a continuing kind of source of tension and a problem. Another problem is that many of the upstream countries, so Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, they are poorer than their neighbors. They're poorer than Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. What is the one source of wealth that they have? It's hydropower. So this also becomes another kind of layer and dimension to the problem.
All right, well, we are at time. And so I want to thank Professor Cameron for this wonderful talk.